In this video we're going to look at scene layers. In this scene I've got a rounded rectangle and a piece of extruded 3D text. If I rotate my scene around, so I just go like this, you can see that the text is halfway through the rounded rectangle. So let's just go back to our default scene. So now if I move my text from right to left, it actually goes through my rounded rectangle. We probably want it to go in front of this block. We could move this in Z space, but if we move it in Z space, then that changes the size. This is why we have something called scene layers. If you look to the right of the word extruded 3D text 1, there's a little grey dot, and that shows me, if I hover above it, that this is the default layer. I'd like to introduce a new layer, so I'm going to go to my scene 1, go to my properties, and where it says layers, I can add an additional layer. There's a warning sign here saying avoid unnecessary use of layers. See documentation for details. Every time you add a layer, it's another round of processing that the processor has to do. So we always try and keep the layers down to a minimum number. Here I've added a layer. If I go along to my extruded 3D text, if I right click, I can now make that layer 1. Now if I orbit around my scene, the position is still there. So we haven't changed the Z position or the size at all. But if I go to my extruded 3D text and move it to the left, it's now in front of the 3D object. And that's because we've put this layer 1, which is in front of the default layer. Now anything that's in a layer, so if I select the layer and go to the properties, you can blur items that are in a layer. You can change the opacity of things that are in a layer. You can also change the anti-aliasing quality, so you can soup it up and make it performance. And what this means is if you're not rotating an object and you're just moving it in a flat dimension, then it doesn't have to do extra sampling to cope for rotations of 3D. And of course we can hide that whole layer. Look at the render view, that's hidden, that's not hidden. Layers, if I add this to layer 1 now, they're both in the same layer. So if I wanted them both in layers, I'd have to go to the scene tree, maybe add another layer and then put this one into layer 2. So now I've got 2 layers. So when it renders each frame, it's now doing 2 cycles of rendering just to put the layer in front. Some things within layers are very, very useful. If we look at materials, we have the blending modes of the layers, of the materials. And we have things like layer arrays and layer color. For these to work properly, you do need to add a new layer. If you use it in the background layer, you might get a strange response if you're doing a layer arrays. So that's 3D layers. Because this is now layer 2, if I rotate both objects around, you'll see that always remains in front, even when I've rotated it all the way around. Go to the scene tree and I can move layer 1 so it is in front of layer 2. So now my rounded rectangle will always remain in front. And this has put our text actually inside of our box. So let's go back to our layers, scene layers, let's put layer 2 after layer 1. So these are some of the uses of scene layers. If you're building flat graphics that don't have to rotate around, you do have another option open to you. If you're working in orthogonal space, that means there's no parallax. What you can do, here's exactly the same 3D text. If I move it forwards in Z space, it doesn't change the size. And the reason it doesn't change the size is because it's expecting to work in a flat dimension. Although it has moved it physically forwards in Z space, there is no change in size. This is a very efficient way to do it because you're working completely in the background layer. The only disadvantage of this is the layer arrays will not work in this mode because both the objects are in the same layer. So that's two ways of putting objects in front of each other without changing their size.